Our first reading today comes from the book of Esther. We rarely have readings from that book, and so today I want to speak about that book and its surprising message and where it has led me. In preparing the sermon, I've been helped by a very scholarly work on Esther by none other than the Bishop of Gippsland, the Right Reverend Dr. Richard Treloar. It's his doctoral thesis, and it was published with the title, Esther and the End of Final Solutions. The book of Esther is set in the Persian capital of Susa in the reign of King Ahasuerus, and scholars debate whether it's in the 5th century or the 4th century before Christ. The book is one of many writings after the exile of Jews in Babylon and the return of some Jews to Palestine, thanks to Cyrus, king of Persia, who swept victoriously across the whole ancient Near East, including capturing Babylon, and Jews were set free by him to return to their homelands. Many did, but not all did. All, nevertheless, were within the Persian Empire, stretching from India to Ethiopia, and this is the setting of the story. The book describes the origins of the Jewish feast of Purim, celebrated each year, and next year celebrated on the 16th and 17th of March. That's not what the book is all about, though it gets a Guernsey. The book's theme, rather, is the reversal of the destiny of Jews through a sudden and unexpected turn of events. The Jews throughout the Persian Empire were destined to be destroyed totally, but instead are saved. Now, before I say any more about the story, I want to say something about the text of this book. It has a core written in Hebrew, to which has been added a number of sections in Greek. This is not really surprising when you remember the whole of the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, beginning with the first 5 books in the 3rd century before Christ. Legend has it that 72 scholars, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, were the translators. Most English translations of Esther don't distinguish the Hebrew core and the Greek additions. You just read them all on. However, the Jerusalem Bible does do this by putting the Greek additions in italics and the Hebrew core in regular print. I mention this because today's reading is drawn largely from the Hebrew core, chapter 7, verses 1 to 20, and 3 verses from the Greek addition, chapter 9, verses 20 to 22. Now, you may wonder why on earth the Greek additions were made to the Hebrew core of the story of Esther. Is there anything about that core that it needed to be supplemented? Well, perhaps the most striking thing is that the core makes no mention of God. You may recall there is another book in the Bible that makes no mention of God. It's the Hebrew Bible as well, of course, and it is the love story in the Song of Songs. But that was never supplemented by Greek additions. And so again, you may wonder, what is it about God not being mentioned in the Hebrew core of the book of Esther that called for these additions? Well, the story is full of Jewish humour, which alas I can't share with you because time is on the wing. But so here is a brutally brief summary. The king of Persia sets aside his beautiful wife because she humiliated him in public, and he organises to get a new, young, beautiful wife, Esther, who is a Jewess, but who does not reveal her Jewish identity to the king or anyone else. Esther was brought to the king's attention by her Jewish uncle, Mordecai. The king's second in command is a man called Haman, before whom everyone must bow. Mordecai refuses, and Haman learns it is because of his Jewishness. So, with the king's authority, Haman orders all the Jews in the Persian Empire to be killed. No messing with Haman. Mordecai discovers Haman's plan and implores Esther to intercede with the king. But she is afraid to present herself to the king unsummoned, because the law of the Persians and Medes is that if you come to the king's presence unsummoned, you will be put to death unless the king gives you pardon. And another detail in the story at this point is that Esther hasn't been called to the king for any reason in the last 30 days. Perhaps he's lost interest in her. So, now, Mordecai urges Esther, nevertheless, to go ahead and intercede, saying she won't escape if she does nothing. And he says this in a very important line: "Who knows if you haven't come to the throne for just such a time as this?" Well, Esther goes to the king, who receives her, so she lives, and she invites him and Haman to a feast, as we heard, during which she asks them to come to a second feast, right, the next evening. And at the second feast, Esther reveals to them that she is Jewish and that Haman has ordered all Jews to be exterminated, herself included. Overcome by rage, the king orders Haman hanged on the very gallows that Haman had prepared for Mordecai. So, unable to annul a formal royal decree, the king instead adds to it, permitting the Jews to join together and to destroy any and all of those seeking to kill them, which they do. Mordecai and Esther send letters throughout the provinces, instituting an annual commemoration of the Jewish people's redemption in a holiday called Purim. The king remains very powerful and continues his reign, with Mordecai assuming a very prominent place in his court. So this is a brutal summary of the Hebrew core of the book of Esther, and you may still be wondering why anything had to be added. Well, notice, God doesn't act to save the Jews in this story as God did in liberating Jews from slavery in Egypt. And notice that the story doesn't mention God. Right? There are no prayers to God. And Mordecai, and especially Esther, get through the crisis by drawing on their own wits and their own strengths. They survive, and all the Jews in the empire survive, with no thanks to God. Now, some of you might be asking, Stephen, where is this leading? And my brothers and sisters, I beg you, stay with me. Now, we can all see why later Jewish rabbis added prayers to God. Mordecai and Esther praying to God. And of course, they're answered. The Jews survive. And this makes God's presence explicit now as the story is retold. Right? And that fits more with the established Jewish view of God and of the Jews as the people of God. It's all perfectly understandable. But what scholars like the Bishop of Gippsland have shown us is an earlier version of the story, authored by a Jew, in which God plays no part, where the key figures make no mention of God and do not pray. Why on earth was it important for this strange Jewish story to be written? Well, it would be important for any individual or group who simply valued the survival of the Jews. We hear this in people speaking, many of Holocaust survivors. We also get a sense of the sheer importance of survival when we hear First Nations people acclaim the fact that after all they have endured, they have survived, and how important to them that this be asserted and acknowledged and valued and by them and by us. Right? Now, we could go through that door. But this morning I don't want to do that, but I want you to hold that thought while I open another door. You see, I found myself asking if there was a way the rabbis could have added to this strange story while keeping its strangeness to the fore, right? Rather than hiding its strangeness by absorbing it into the prevailing mainstream of Orthodox Jewish practice. And with Bishop Richard's help, I think so. For the rabbis could have drawn attention, right, to the many texts in the Hebrew tradition that speak of God hiding God's face. Deuteronomy 31, verse 17, Psalm 10, verse 1, Psalm 13, verse 1, Psalm 27, verse 9, Psalm 44, verse 1, Psalm 83, verse 1, and of course Isaiah 45, verse 15, which says, "O Lord, truly, you are a God that hides himself." So you can see how such texts could be woven together in a way that would connect to the core of the story of Esther, where God is not even mentioned. In Christian spiritual traditions, this is called the dark night of the soul, where for a time God hides God's face from the soul on its life journey. Now, I've heard it suggested that our whole culture is going through a dark night of the soul, where all the previous markers of God's presence, of meaning and value, for many people, have disappeared or are disappearing. This is suggesting that God is hiding God's face from truckloads of people in our culture. And when I say that Esther and Mordecai don't mention God, they don't pray to God, they rely entirely on their own wits and resources, am I not describing many, many people in our culture? People from whom God has hidden God's face. Of course, these people would say, on the contrary, it's just that there is no God. I think most Christians who worship every day and gather weekly in their churches for worship do not think of God as hiding God's face from them. If that is so, are we not to use that knowledge to show people without presumption, without being up ourselves in any way, how God is hidden in our daily lives? That is to make the case for God. A person who is doing that publicly, for example, right now is Greg Sheridan, a Catholic layman who is the foreign affairs correspondent for the Australian newspaper. Another more famous person who does it is Paul in chapter 1 of Romans or in chapter 17 of Acts. Right? But the person who most pointedly makes the case for God in all its strangeness is Jesus of Nazareth. And this shows up in all the conflict stories that we find in the New Testament, which is part of the reason why I suggested during the discussion of discipleship that it would be good to study the conflict episodes in the New Testament, to see Jesus, the case that he makes for God and how extraordinarily provocative it is. But that would be for another time. Now, you might feel this is all right, but not quite for you just yet. So let's just step back from any one of us doing this and talk about the cathedral. Because I think the cathedral has opportunity to make the case for God in addition to any other way it is presently doing so. And I'm referring to its music. This is the other door I just want to open this morning. The cathedral, on any standard, the cathedral is a highly credible example of music making. So we are perfectly placed to inquire into whether and how and in what way, right, there's a case for saying God is hidden in human musicality in all its forms, of which we have here in the cathedral a most excellent example. Now you might say, look, for me, it's the experience of music that is, if there's any sense of God being present, it's through the experience of the beauty and the majesty and the power of music. And I'm sure that is so for many people who gather for worship, for example. But it won't do to say that the sheer experience of God that music makes the case for God. End of story. Here's my example. Stephen Fry loves great music. And Stephen Fry thinks that we won't again get any music of the quality, depth and range of Bach, the deeply devout Christian, because, says Stephen Fry, we aren't religious like that anymore. But Stephen Fry insists that this is no argument for God with regard to music. And so what I believe is needed are musical scholars, of which there are many, Christian musical scholars, of which there are many, and some of whom could help us analyze the composing and performing and the experience of music making, and how God is intimated, hidden in that music making. And my brothers and sisters, I wouldn't want you to think that I'm a book soldier in this matter, for I've been pursuing that very same agenda with regard to human inquiry in the sciences, with regard to the great laws of physics, and with regard to the care of people with dementia. So yes, I'm imagining that what it would be like if we could make the case for God being hidden in all human musicality, and that it was strong enough in its articulation, right, to stand up in public, right? How good would that be, given how important music is to every human being in every culture? How good would that be? So may God bless us. My brothers and sisters, who knows? Perhaps our musical tradition at the cathedral has come to its present excellence for just such a moment as this. Amen.